Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support me. The land of Alderaan lay beneath a sky as dark as coal, the faint outline of the sun barely visible through the thick clouds of ash that had blanketed the world for months. The people spoke in whispers, rumors spreading like wildfire about the resurgence of the Shadow Crown, an ancient relic with the power to control life and death itself. Few dared to believe it, but even fewer dared to question it. There was an unshakable feeling in the air that something terrible was coming. Carlos, a young thief in the sprawling city of Blackreach, had heard the rumors, but like most things, beyond his daily struggle for survival, he pushed them aside. He wasn't interested in old legends or powerful artifacts. His world was much smaller: the winding alleyways of Blackreach, the rooftop hideouts, and the ever-watchful city guard. His one goal was to escape the endless cycle of theft and poverty, to find a way out before it swallowed him whole. Tonight he had a target, one that could change everything. "Keep an eye out," Carlos whispered to himself as he crouched on the edge of a rooftop, his eyes scanning the courtyard below. A noble's mansion loomed in front of him, its high walls and barred windows promising riches beyond Carlos's wildest dream. He had heard whispers of a strange relic in the noble's possession, something small but immensely valuable. If he could steal it, maybe he could buy his freedom. Slipping silently down the side of the building, Carlos landed in the courtyard with a soft thud. His heart raced, but his movements were calculated and smooth, the product of years spent evading detection. He crept toward the back door, the lock quickly falling victim to his skilled hand. With a quiet creak, the door swung open, and Carlos slipped inside. The mansion was eerily quiet as Carlos moved through its grand halls, his footsteps muffled by the thick rugs beneath him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. His target lay in a small room at the end of a narrow corridor. It was a simple display case with a single piece of glass protecting a fragment of what looked like blackened metal. Carlos's brow furrowed. This was the relic. It did look like mud. Shrugging, Carlos reached for the lock on the case, but the moment his fingers touched the glass, a shock of energy coursed through his body. He gasped, stumbling back, his vision blurring. The fragment glowed faintly, casting strange shadows on the wall. Carlos' heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just some trinket. It was something much, much more. Before he could react, the door behind him burst open. Two shadowy figures rushed in, their faces obscured by dark hoods. Carlos' instincts kicked in, and he bolted, darting past them and down the hallway. The relic still buzzed in his pocket, its presence both a comfort and a curse. He could hear the figures behind him, their footsteps unnervingly quiet. Bursting through the back door, Carlos sprinted across the courtyard and scaled the wall in record time. His breath came in ragged gasps as he disappeared into the labyrinth of Blackreach, cell alleys, the shadowy figures hot on his heels. He darted through narrow passageways, ducked beneath low, hanging beams, and leaped over obstacles with the grace of a cat. But no matter how fast he moved, the shadows stayed with him. Just when he thought he was cornered, a figure emerged from the darkness ahead of him. Carlos skidded to a halt, his hand instinctively going to the dagger at his side. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice tight with fear. The figure stepped forward, revealing a woman with sharp, angular features and piercing green eyes. Her movements were as fluid as water, and her hand rested lightly on the hilt of a long, curved blade. "Elena," she said, her voice cold and measured. "I could ask you the same question." Carlos blinked, momentarily taken aback by her calm demeanor. "I don't have time for this," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. The shadows were closing in. "You were carrying something dangerous," Elena continued, her eyes narrowing. "Something that doesn't belong to you." "Doesn't matter how you got it," Elena interrupted, her tone hardening. "What matters is who sat after you because of it." As if on cue, the shadowy figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, their movements unnaturally fast and silent. Elena drew her blade in one smooth motion, her eyes locking onto Carlos. "Stay behind me if you want to live." Before Carlos could respond, Elena launched herself at the attackers, her blade flashing in the dim light. She moved with deadly precision, each strike calculated and efficient. Carlos watched in stunned silence as she cut down the first figure, then the second. In a matter of moments, it was over. Elena wiped her blade clean, turning to face Carlos. "You are coming with me." Carlos hesitated. He didn't trust her, but the alternative, facing more of those shadowy figures, wasn't very appealing either. With a reluctant nod, he followed her into the night. As they moved through the city, Elena explained the situation. The relic Carlos had stolen was a fragment of the Shadow Crown, a powerful artifact long thought lost to time. It was said to hold the power over life and death itself, and now that Carlos had a piece of it, he was a target. "They'll keep coming for you," Elena said as they ducked into a hidden passageway beneath the city, and they won. "Three, stop until they have the whole crown." Carlos shivered, the weight of the fragment in his pocket suddenly feeling much heavier. "Why do you care?" Elena glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "I'd just say I have my own reasons for wanting to keep the crown out of the wrong hand." They emerged from the passageway into a small, dimly lit room. A third figure stood, waiting, his broad shoulders and stocky build unmistakable. He was a dwarf with a long, braided beard and a massive hammer strapped to his back. "Ari, Bruno," Elena said by way of introduction. "He soaring to help us." Bruno grunted in acknowledgement, his eyes narrowing as he studied Carlos. "You re the one with the fragment." Carlos nodded, his hand instinctively going to his pocket. "I didn't mean to get involved in this too." "Late for that," Bruno said gruffly. "You re in it now." The trio sat around a makeshift table, the dim light casting long shadows on the wall. Elena and Bruno explained the full story. The Shadow Crown had been broken into several pieces long ago, each fragment scattered across the land to prevent its full power from being unleashed. But now an ancient cult dedicated to the Crown's resurrection had resurfaced, and they were hunting down the fragment. "We have to stop them," Bruno said, his voice low and serious. "If they get the crown, it's the end of everything." Carlos listened in silence, the gravity of the situation sinking in. He didn't want to be part of this. He just wanted to live his life free of all this madness. But as he looked at the fragment in his hand, he realized there was no going back. "What do we do next?" Carlos asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. Elena met his gaze, her green eyes burning with determination. "We find the other fragments before they do." As the night wore on, Carlos felt the weight of his newfound responsibility settle deeper into his bones. He had never asked for any of this. A simple heist, gone wrong, had now become a life or death quest. His fingers brushed against the fragment in his pocket, feeling the cold, smooth surface. Despite everything Elena and Bruno had told him, it still seemed unreal. The power to control life and death. He wanted, but he couldn't deny the truth staring him in the face. The forces chasing him weren't going to stop, and the fragment was his burden now. Elena and Bruno had begun discussing their next move, mapping out a strategy to find the remaining fragment. Carlos tried to follow along, but his mind kept wandering. He was no warrior or assassin. He'd survived Blackreach by being fast, clever, and unseen. But these two, they lived for danger, fought head-on. He wasn't tall like them. "You listening, thief?" Bruno's gravelly voice snapped Carlos out of his thought. The dwarf's keen eyes were fixed on him, his arms crossed over his broad chest. "Yeah, I'm listening," Carlos muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure he had been. His gaze flicked to Elena, who was sharpening her blade with slow, deliberate strokes. She didn't look up. "We move at dawn," Bruno said. "There's another fragment hidden in the Iron Peak Mountain. It's deep within my people's territory, but getting there won't be easy. The cult's agents are everywhere." Carlos nodded, but a pit formed in his stomach. The idea of trekking through a mountain range filled with enemies, with nothing more than a dagger for protection, made his skin crawl. "And what happens when we get there?" "You just waltz in and take the fragment." Bruno's lips twisted into a humorless smile. "If only it were that simple. My people have guarded that fragment for centuries. They won, just hand it over, even to me." Carlos frowned. "So what's the plan?" Elena finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "We convince them, or if it comes to it, we take it." Carlos sighed, running a hand through his hair. He could feel the tension in the room. Bruno was protective of his clan, that much was obvious, but Elena wasn't one to waste time on diplomacy if it meant losing the fragment to the cult. He had seen how she fought, how her blade moved like an extension of her body. She wasn't afraid to spill blood. The trio set out at dawn, the city of Blackreach disappearing behind them as they made their way toward the Iron Peak Mountain. The journey was long and arduous, the landscape shifting from the rolling plains surrounding the city to the jagged rocky terrain that marked the beginning of the mountain. The air grew colder with each passing day, and Carlos found himself shivering beneath his cloak, his boots crunching against the frost-covered ground. Alina led the way, her movements silent and sure-footed even in the treacherous terrain. Bruno followed close behind, his stout frame seemingly unaffected by the cold. Carlos trailed behind them, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. For the first few days, they encountered no sign of the cult, said agents, though the tension never left. Carlos sent by. He kept expecting shadows to leap out from the craggy rocks at any moment. But as they reached the lower slopes of the Iron Peaks, that quiet dread finally materialized. It was late afternoon, the sun sinking low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocky landscape. Carlos had been lagging behind, his legs aching from the steep climb when he heard the sound of footsteps not from Alina or Bruno, but from somewhere behind them. He froze, straining his ears. The footsteps were soft, barely audible, but they were there. Someone or something was following them. Alina, he whispered, his voice tight with fear. She turned her hand, instinctively going to the hilt of her blade. What is it? Someone's behind us, Carlos said, his pulse quickening. Bruno turned as well, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the rocks. How many? I don't know, I just heard footsteps. Alina didn't wait. She darted up the nearest rise, crouching low as she peered over the edge. A moment later, she signaled for them to follow her. Bruno and Carlos crept up the rocky slope, joining her behind a cluster of boulders. From their vantage point, they could see the figures below, half a dozen of them, moving in perfect silence, their black cloaks blending into the shadows. Cultists, Alina hissed under her breath. Bruno gripped the handle of his warhammer. How did they find us? They've been tracking us since we left Black Reach, Alina said. They were just waiting for the right moment to strike. Carlos' heart pounded in his chest. What do? We fight, Alina said simply, her eyes cold and determined. Carlos wanted to argue, wanted to suggest running, but he knew it was pointless. There was no outrunning them, not here, not in the mountain. The cultists spread out, their movements slow and methodical, as if they knew exactly where their prey was hiding. Alina motioned for Bruno to take the left flank while she moved to the right. Carlos remained in the center, his hand gripping the dagger at his side. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his shaking hand. The cultists were almost upon them when Alina made her move. She sprang from her hiding spot, her blade flashing in the fading light. The first cultist fell before he even knew what hit him, his body crumpling to the ground in a heap. Bruno followed suit, charging into the fray with a roar, his warhammer smashing through the skull of another cultist with a sickening crunch. Carlos hesitated for a moment, fear gripping him, but then he forced himself to move. He lunged at the nearest cultist, his dagger sinking into the man's side. The cultist let out a grunt of pain, but before Carlos could pull the blade free, the man backhanded him across the face, sending him sprawling to the ground. Dazed Carlos struggled to his feet, blood trickling from his split lip. The cultist loomed over him, a wicked-looking blade glinting in his hand. Carlos' heart raced as he scrambled for his dagger, but it had slipped from his grasp during the fall. Panic surged through him. Just as the cultist raised his blade to strike, a sharp whistle cut through the air, followed by a dull thud. The cultist staggered, then collapsed, an arrow protruding from his neck. Carlos looked up to see Alina standing on the ridge, her bow in hand, her face impassive. Get up, she said, not unkindly, but without room for debate. Carlos wiped the blood from his lip and scrambled to his feet. He retrieved his dagger and took stock of the scene. The cultists were either dead or dying, their bodies strewn across the rocky ground. Bruno was panting heavily, his warhammer slick with blood, but he seemed otherwise unharmed. Alina, as always, appeared untouched by the chaos. She slung her bow across her back and approached Carlos, her sharp eyes scanning him for injuries.
You all right?
Carlos nodded, though. His heart was still racing. I am fine. She gave a short nod, then turned to Bruno. We need to keep moving. They'll send more. Bruno grunted in agreement, wiping the blood from his hammer and his cloak. Let's soon go. They continued their journey into the mountains, the air growing colder with each passing day. The path became steeper and more treacherous, and Carlos found himself relying more and more on Alina and Bruno to guide him through the rough terrain. He could feel the weight of the fragment in his pocket, heavier with each step, as if it knew they were getting closer to the next piece. Finally, after days of grueling travel, they reached the entrance to the Iron Peak Dwarven Hold. It was carved into the side of the mountain, its massive stone doors standing tall and imposing, guarded by two dwarves in heavy armor. Bruno stepped forward, his chest puffing out as he addressed the guards in their native tongue. After a tense moment, the doors creaked open and they were led inside. The dwarven hold was a vast network of tunnels and chambers, illuminated by glowing crystals embedded in the wall. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and metal, and the sound of hammers on anvils echoed through the hall. Carlos felt a sense of awe as he took in the sheer size of the place. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Bruno led them through the winding tunnels to the inner sanctum, where the fragment was kept. It was here that the real challenge awaited them, not the journey, but convincing the dwarves to part with the fragment. Carlos could see the tension in Bruno's sad face as they approached the chamber. This wasn't going to be easy, and he was right. Inside the chamber, the dwarven council awaited them. The elders sat around a large stone table, their bearded faces stern and unyielding. At the center of the room, on a pedestal carved from black stone, sat the fragment glowing faintly, just like the one in Carlos' hind pocket. "We have no quarrel with you," Bruno began, his voice respectful but firm. "But the time has come to let go of the fragment. If it remains here, it will bring nothing but death and destruction to our people." The council murmured among themselves. But the leader, an elder with a braided silver beard, shook his head. "The fragment has been in our care for generations. It is our duty to protect it." Carlos felt the frustration building inside him. Protect it from what? The cult is already here. They'll stop at nothing to get the crown, and Yuri sitting on one of the pieces. The elder's eyes narrowed. "You speak out of turn." Carlos bit back a retort, but Alina stepped forward, her voice calm and authoritative. "The thief is right. Your enemies are already moving against you. The only way to ensure the safety of your people is to destroy the crown before they can get their hands on it." For a moment there was silence. The tension in the room was palpable. Finally, the elder sighed. "Very well, but know this. If you fail in your mission, it will be on your heads, not ours." As they left the dwarven hold, fragment in hand, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that things were only going to get worse from here. The shadows were closing in, and the weight of the crown was growing heavier with each step.